Alexei Biryachenko, professor at the Kiev Aviation Institute, president of the International Institute for Security Studies, is now joining us live. Hello.
Hello, friends. I'm glad to see you, and I greet all our esteemed viewers.
Alexei, right now, Russians are confused, wondering what is going on? Why is this happening to us? That's their signature phrase. And to our surprise, even now, they still don't seem to understand the cause and effect relationship. But why are the sellers suffering? They also don't get it. Wildberries, this Russian marketplace, is openly selling goods, just selling products. Well, at least they were selling before. Maybe after these sanctions from Ukraine, they'll stop. But for now, it's still unclear. These are goods that are used by the Russian military, meaning they're directly involved in the war, and all of this is openly available. Just Google it, or whatever search engine they use, and you'll see. It's all pretty obvious. What needs to happen for it to finally sink in for Russians, as they say? Why is it that even Peskov admits that, yes, the war is happening on their territory, on the territory of the Russian Federation?
Well, you see, there's a struggle going on between reality and the propagandists, and the propaganda image that's being pushed on Russians by people like Solovyov, Skabiva, and basically the entire Kremlin circle. So, inevitably, one way or another, reality always wins out, just like the refrigerator always wins. That's why, let's put it this way, the sociology recently demonstrated by our president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and which lands on Putin's desk, shows that support among Russians for the president of the Russian Federation is declining. And let's say there could be problems again with the upcoming Duma elections. And we have no doubt here that they will fabricate any numbers regarding support for what Putin is doing. But people understanding the consequences, because in Russia, as you correctly pointed out, not everyone always fully understands these consequences. It's one thing when it's like a computer game. You're playing something somewhere. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but it's all still very far from your own home, far away. But in this particular case, Russians are constantly feeling for themselves now that they really did start the war, that they unleashed this war. Whether they want it or not, this war will still come to their homes. That's the absolute reality because Ukraine is not the kind of country that will just stay silent and endure Russian aggression. Yes, absolutely. Ukraine will bring the war onto the aggressor's territory. Yes, absolutely. All infrastructure, energy, and military facilities that are connected to Russia's ability to wage war are absolutely legitimate targets for Ukraine. And in fact, Ukraine has always stated this. This is in line with the United Nations Charter, which gives countries the right to self defense. So, as they say, if someone doesn't understand what's happening with, say, wildberries, they just need to turn off the TV and realize one thing. If any international logistics and supply chain network is actively involved in transporting dual use goods, let's call it what it really is, a clear case of illegal smuggling, which is then integrated directly into the operations of the military industrial complex, well, yes, such a logistics network automatically becomes a completely legitimate target for Ukrainian strikes. And here, by the way, it's not Ukraine. I'm talking about the Russians. Yes, Russians. They shouldn't be blaming Ukraine for this, as if Ukraine is shelling some civilian sites. No, absolutely not. Because after the Russians started transporting and distributing heavy military equipment, along with various components for drones and other essentially sophisticated engineering products of the military industry through these facilities, this entire network completely ceased to be considered a civilian infrastructure. That is exactly why the Russian people need to be very clear about one specific thing. The Russian military frequently uses these kinds of seemingly innocent civilian logistics networks in order to carefully hide the strategic movement of their essential military components. So, Russians should be asking questions, first and foremost to Putin, and above all to their own military, about why these dual use components, so to speak, aren't being transported by their own logistics, by military transport. By doing so, of course, they're automatically putting people at risk and in danger. And they're disguising this logistics as civilian. By doing this, of course, let's say ordinary Russians who use this kind of logistics will suffer, as well as Russian businesses that rely on it. I think, most likely, after lessons like this, Wildberries and other logistics networks will have to go down one of two paths. It's possible that they might either shut down, well, if the Russian military says, we're going to keep using you as a logistics tool, or they might continue doing this at their own risk. But in the second case, there's a big question. Will they, for example, be able to go to an insurance company later and get compensation for what happened? Because they're knowingly taking on the responsibility of essentially being part of the war. And if it's a serious Western insurance company or one with Western investments, I have serious doubts that they will pay out the relevant insurance claims.
You know, Alexei, I was listening to you, and honestly, you're reasoning from a place of sound logic, from a rational perspective. But in Russia, public opinion and public consciousness work a little differently. After all, you have to admit, there are those who, seeing what's happening, which is hard to hide, even though official television in Russia, of course, downplays the reports, there are those who see it and say, so why is Putin being so soft? Come on, push harder, use nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. And there are people like that too. In this sense, what scares me the most is who will the current Russian authorities listen to? Those concerned, outraged Russians who have started to understand what's happening and why, with their warehouses and all that. And, well, they've started to feel it. There's no way to hide it anymore. Or those who, on the contrary, will say, it's okay, we'll endure, let's go all the way, let's push through to victory, and so on.
You know, it's great that we have the opportunity to broadcast in Russian so that maybe some Russians, through VPNs or whatever they're using, can still hear us. And you're asking a very good question because Russians, unfortunately, are used to thinking within the paradigm of the aggressor in an imperial paradigm, one way or another. But how far have they already gone? Even the Russians themselves can see that they're buying gasoline with ration cards in two-thirds of the regions of the Russian Federation, that Ukraine has already completely or partially disabled about 60% of their oil refineries, and that our long-haul sanctions are basically covering 100% of Russian refineries now. Well, because, again, most of them are mainly in the western part of Russia. And this, among other things, is seriously hitting the economy through secondary processing. That's plastics, that's bitumen, that's construction. I'm not even mentioning the agricultural crisis that Russia is gradually sinking into because farmers simply can't get fuel. And somehow, Russia is frantically trying to figure out how much diesel each farmer needs, well, yes, for agricultural machinery, and to restrict any other access for them on their own. So, can you imagine what kind of insane pressure this is putting on the Russian Federation's economy because of these long haul sanctions from Ukraine? Well, of course, this profoundly impacts and influences both the overall purchasing power of individuals, the ability to generate a steady income, the capacity to invest for the future, and many other fundamental aspects of the daily lives of ordinary citizens everywhere. And so, a Russian citizen who legitimizes this kind of policy by Putin, who might even be pushing him toward more radical actions, needs to realize that if this escalation by the Russian Federation continues, then he personally, no matter where he is, whether in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Rostov, will end up living much, much worse. And what can we even say if Russia, for example, resorts to using some kind of tactical nuclear weapon? I can't even imagine that because the world of Russians would just be crushed in an instant. And those half measures of sanctions that are now just slowly strangling Russia's economy will, at some point, simply bring it to its knees and lock them up like wild animals in a cage, a kind of economic cage called a full economic embargo. If you don't understand what that is, just open Google or whatever search engine they use now and blocked Russia and just read about what it is and what consequences such actions can have.
Well, for now, a full embargo, which, by the way, I've been asking various experts about for years, is still a long way off. There are reasons for that, but for now, I'd like to understand just how far diplomacy has gotten, so to speak. Because, for example, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Lavrov, stated that any peace agreement on Ukraine must include, and I quote, an inevitable element of compromise. He said this after talks with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, according to TASS. Lavrov also commented on the meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and the Russian dictator Putin in Alaska, stating that it still remains to be seen who actually failed. In addition, he once again accused Western countries of supplying weapons to Ukraine. Let me remind you, Rubio and Lavrov met in the Philippines. And here it's important to understand, when we talk about an inevitable element of compromise, whose side are we talking about? They always seem to imply it's Ukraine that has to compromise. But when it comes to their own side, they keep quiet about it. So what compromises is Russia actually willing to make? Or does this word not even apply in Russia's understanding of diplomacy? Well, let me remind you that Rubio said new ideas are needed to achieve peace. The US is ready to offer its own options. And also, why did Rubio start talking about new ideas and new options in the first place? He says the situation has changed. Russia's taken hits deep inside its own territory. Wake up, guys. But if we also look at Lavrov's rhetoric, he said it's not manly. Supposedly there were some agreements. Where are these agreements? From which side? And who signed them? No one knows. And this time, Rubio's spirit of anchorage didn't work. Alexei, what kind of compromises and new ideas do you think they're talking about?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, Lavrov, out of helplessness and after what was clearly a failed meeting with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, just blurted out too much. I think Putin will definitely remember this emotional outburst when Lavrov basically started blaming, in that so called spirit of anchorage, primarily the United States of America. This is very dangerous rhetoric. Just look at what the Russian Federation did, how they tried, as diplomats say, to stay on their feet, even if just for half an hour, to get a brief audience with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. They even flew to the ASEAN summit in the Philippines just to make diplomatic contact. Why is this happening? It's actually very simple, friends. We need to understand that aside from the United States of America, aside from President Trump himself, there is no other figure in the world who can lift the sanctions from Putin and the Russian Federation and essentially bring them back into the global context. The Europeans can't do this either. They're just not in the right position right now, to be honest. And China simply won't do it because they're competing with Russia in many areas and in many markets. So when Putin ditched Trump with that so-called spirit of anchorage, and when everyone finally realized that there would be no spirit of anchorage and that this Moscow trap hadn't worked, Russia decided, as a matter of principle, to resume some kind of high-level contacts with the Americans, and they pushed for this meeting. So what was the outcome? As for the outcome, Marco Rubio, very calmly, like an experienced diplomat, laid everything out, and said that yes, the United States would fulfill its moderating role in ending the Russia Ukraine war if a real opportunity for that arises. He also noted that it is absolutely clear that the agreements in Anchorage, that so called spirit of Anchorage, are absolutely not in Ukraine's interests and therefore are unacceptable for Ukraine. And as a result of this meeting, he also stated that Russia wanted the United States to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine, but the United States will continue to provide these weapons in the future. Yes, then Donald Trump himself kind of clarified further after Rubio, saying that it's as if they're not supplying weapons to Ukraine, they're supplying them through programs like Pearl to their NATO partners. But nevertheless, let's just say this whole scheme has long been clear to everyone. At the meeting in Manila, of course, Russian diplomacy and Lavrov himself suffered a final and serious defeat. And as for what to do about it, in my opinion, they still don't fully understand.